Okay, part 3 of 3, chapter 14. So, we've looked at quite a bit so far. We're almost done with the biomedical and social medical issues that anthropologists look at. So, the staff attitude affect healthcare delivery system. In her ethnographic work, Reproducing Race, anthropologist Kira Bridges examines the different health disparities among New York women. As part of her study, Bridges noted significant racial disparities among women and children in the United States. She found that African American women are 3 times more likely to die for complications during pregnancies and childbirth than Euro American women. She also found that African American babies were 2.5 times more likely to die in infancy than Euro American babies. While race is an apparent factor here, Bridges wanted to make sure. She therefore compared African American women and Euro American women with similar social economic backgrounds. Even when controlling these variables, African American women face significantly higher health risks. Bridges wanted to explore why there was such an overt racial disparity in health. As such, she carried out her ethnographic fieldwork at a women's health clinic in Manhattan's East Side. This clinic provided health care services for women on Medicaid. This clinic saw primarily women of lower economic class and predominantly women from who were minorities. In addition, the clinic served as a top-tier teaching hospital. Thus, doctors and nurses trained in this environment eventually went to serve people in other hospitals and clinics. During her study, Bridges noted that due to the Medicare requirements, doctors and nurses were required to treat patients in particular ways. Patients were subjected to invasive interviews about personal practices. They had to attain mandatory counseling sessions, and they were required to undergo invasive exams. None of these practices would be typical procedures for non-Medicare patients. Bridges argued that through their training, doctors and nurses became accustomed to treating minority women in this manner. She also found that oral traditions were passed down between the students. Including oral traditions were many myths about bodies of African American women. Students would talk about African American women as having a higher threshold for pain and endurance, and discuss their bodies were more primitive. Particularly because of this clinic's being a training site, Bridges was able to argue that the lessons learned were carried out by doctors and nurses and thus negatively affected the health of African American women. So, how is globalization changing? With the growing effects of globalization, our concepts of health and illness are being affected by 2 primary ways: by so-called medical migration and by the interaction between multiple systems of health and healing. Medical migration is a broad term used to refer to the movement of people for medical reasons, diseases themselves, and systems of healing. The movement of diseases in particular is a growing concern in today's world. Viral and bacterial infections do not face the same barriers as human migrants, i.e., the pandemic that we're living through right now. These infections can easily cross nation borders and move around the globe with incredible speed. Part of living in a globalized world is acceptance that diseases are now global and not local threats. People also travel for medical reasons. Today, it's not uncommon for economic elite in the peripheral nations to travel to core nations for advanced medical treatment, such as surgeries or transplant. This reverse will also happen with the moderately wealthy of the core nations will travel to peripheral nations in search of cheaper services. Impoverished migrants will often seek to cross national borders to find better access to basic health care. So people are constantly seeking out either the best care they can receive or the cheapest care they can receive. Global economic systems are also a result of heavily international drug trades. So these practices are generally illegal and by the U.S. law, although there are definitely loopholes. This has not stopped consumers from seeking out cheaper drug prices found in Canada to compare with the extraordinary high rates charged in the same drugs at the United States. All these factors lead to a near constant state of medical migration. So, we have already seen how traditional Chinese medicine has become prominent in many parts of the world, but similar processes of interaction continue throughout the world. Unfortunately, these interactions between health systems sometimes lead to misunderstandings and even conflicts. So, this book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, is a very sad case of Hmong refugees in the United States healthcare system. So, in her documentation, Fadiman writes down the story of young Layli, who was born to Hmong refugees living in California. Many Hmong refugees fled Laos in 1970s and 80s to escape repressive regime in the regions. At 3 months of age, Layli began to have seizures. Her parents had identified the illness as equivalent to what they had called epilepsy in the United States. Among the Hmong, such conditions were often held in great esteem. While it was known that the seizures could be dangerous, these individuals often became powerful shamans due to the perceived connection to the divine. Lay's parents sought to keep her healthy and guide her through her illness by traditional Hmong methods of healing, including herbal baths and ritual soul callings, which sought to return her soul to her body when it left during a seizure. But during a particularly violent seizure, Lay's parents feared for her life and brought her to the local hospital. On her first visit to the hospital, Lay's condition was misdiagnosed. Her seizures had stopped before they arrived at the hospital, and without a translator, her parents couldn't explain what her daughter was going through. The resident on duty decided it was an infection and sent the family home with medications. Again, without a translator, her parents had no idea what was happening or what the medicine was for. It took several more visits to the hospital before Lay's condition was accurately diagnosed as epilepsy. As her seizures continued, she was brought to the hospital again and again. The doctors kept trying new prescriptions and new doses in an attempt to find a cure, but the linguistic barriers continued, and Lay's parents didn't fully understand the drugs or the amounts being prescribed. Eventually, the doctors recommended that Leah be taken from her parents as they presumed the seizures were continuing through neglect by her parents. The court system agreed, and Leah was taken from her parents, only to have her seizures continue. After a protracted, long-year legal battle, Leah's parents finally got their daughter returned to them, but her condition had not improved. Shortly thereafter, she experienced a major seizure. Doctors attempted to treat her, but Leah's brain had been damaged, and she was ultimately declared to be in a persistent vegetative state. Leah's parents considered her current state to be the fault of various drug cocktails that she was forced to take, and to continue to treat her by Hmong traditional medicines at home. Lee has survived when the Western doctors had predicted she would soon pass away. Lee's parents continue to hope that they will be able to call her soul home. Very, very sad. So, the doctors routinely described Lee's parents as uncooperative and ungrateful for the time and assistance they had received. The parents viewed the doctors as uncommunicative, arrogant, and cold. They also felt the doctors were subjecting their daughter to invasive and inappropriate treatments that they viewed as ineffective. This clash of language, culture, and system of health and healing ultimately led to Lee end up in her current vegetative state. And so this is really a very good way of looking at those differences. Okay, bodies become healthy through both individual and social processes, a complete interplay between genetics and culture. When medical anthropologists consider the body, they think about the individual body and the social body. And so, there's an exercise, but since we're not going to be in class technically, don't have to do it. But do think about the body and how it's perceived in different cultures. So, concept checks. The anthropological concept of health includes A. Physical, mental, and social well-being and the absence of disease. Ethnomedicines focus on B. Study of local systems of health and healing. Biomedicines apply to the principles of biology to the practice of diagnosing diseases. A. Anthropologists can help solve health problems by all of the above. Okay, look at the health discussion questions and just kind of think about it. It might help you to kind of understand what we've been talking about a little bit more. So this is the end of the third section in chapter 14. I will see you for chapter 15 soon.